There's a certain type of fantasy that modern people repeat constantly, usually without noticing, the fantasy of disappearing. Not literally, more like socially, structurally, existentially. Quitting your job and moving somewhere quiet, deleting every app off your phone, living off-grid, being answerable to nobody, waking up with no schedule, no expectations, no obligations pressing against your chest from the moment you open your eyes. Freedom, or at least the image of it. And I think for a long time I assumed that that's what I wanted too. More freedom, more openness, more possibility, the ability to become anyone, live anywhere, do anything. But the older I get, the more I notice something strange happening whenever life becomes too open. I don't become peaceful, I become disorientated, because there's a difference between freedom in theory and freedom as a lived psychological experience. In theory, freedom sounds expansive, human, enlightened even, but in practice, too much freedom can start to feel strangely weightless, like standing in the middle of a massive empty room waiting for someone to tell you where the furniture goes. And modern life is full of that feeling, not because we lack options, but because we have too many. You can feel it in almost every part of life now. Careers used to be narrower, communities were smaller, people inherited religions, roles, traditions, expectations. Your life wasn't infinitely customizable. In many ways, that created limitations, obviously, but it also created orientation. There are rails, now there are almost none. You can reinvent yourself endlessly now. New city, new identity, new aesthetic, new career path, new belief system, new version of yourself every 6 months if you wanted to. The internet turned identity into something editable, and at first that feeling becomes liberating, until you realise that when everything is possible, nothing feels stable enough to stand on for very long. That's the part that people don't talk about enough, because we tend to imagine suffering as something caused by restriction, but some forms of suffering come from the absence of restriction entirely. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote about this long before the internet existed. One of his reoccurring ideas was that human beings often say they want unlimited freedom, but when they actually receive it, they become overwhelmed by the responsibility that it comes with. Not because humans are weak necessarily, but because freedom creates burden. If there's no structure above you, then every decision becomes fully yours. And once every decision becomes fully yours, so does every failure. That's a heavy thing to carry psychologically, especially now when modern culture quietly tells you that your life should be extraordinary and entirely self-created. You're supposed to choose the perfect career, the perfect relationship, the perfect city, the perfect purpose, the perfect self. And because there are thousands of visible alternatives online all at times, every commitment starts feeling haunted by the lives you didn't choose. That's why commitment feels harder now than it used to. Not because people are inherently less disciplined, but because every choice now feels like the elimination of infinite other selves. There's this strange grief hidden inside freedom. The moment you choose one path, 1,000 imagined versions of your future die quietly in the background. And I think that part of modern paralysis comes in from trying to keep all these futures alive at once. You see it everywhere. People hovering between identities for years, endless self-reinvention, constantly course correcting, people consuming productivity content instead of building anything, people researching careers more than living them, people terrified of being tied down, people wanting certainty before movement, as if the correct life can somehow be discovered without being lived first. But life doesn't really work like that. At some point, identity stops becoming something you discover intellectually and starts becoming something you build through repetition and sacrifice. That's why structure feels so comforting sometimes, even to people who claim to hate it. Routines, religious traditions, communities, rules, shared experiences, they reduce psychological noise. They narrow the possibility for action to become clearer. Erich Fromm wrote about this in Escape from Freedom. He argued that modern people often experience freedom not as liberation but as anxiety, because once tradition starts to collapse, the individual becomes fully responsible for constructing meaning alone. And that sounds empowering until you actually try and carry it every day, especially online, where you're exposed to millions of different ways to live simultaneously. At any given moment, somebody your age is becoming a monk in Thailand, somebody else is building a startup, somebody else is traveling to Europe in a van, somebody else is making 6 figures online, someone else is getting married, someone else is deleting social media, and your brain absorbs all of it. So instead of living one life, you start mentally comparing yourself against thousands of parallel possibilities all at once. No wonder people feel exhausted. No wonder commitment feels violent, because choosing one thing now is like rejecting an infinite catalogue of other lives. What's strange is that the moments where people actually seem the most grounded are rarely the moments where they have the most freedom. Usually it's the opposite. People seem the happiest when they're embedded in something. A family, a craft, a community, a responsibility, a tradition, a relationship, a routine. Something that limits them slightly. Something that removes a portion of infinite choice. And maybe that's because human beings don't only need freedom, maybe we also need form. A river with no banks doesn't become more free, it stops being a river entirely, it spills everywhere at once. And I think modern life sometimes does that to people psychologically. Too many directions, too many identities, too many possibilities, too much self-awareness, too much comparison, until eventually the freedom that was supposed to liberate you starts making it harder to become anyone at all. Which is why I'm starting to think the goal isn't unlimited freedom, it's finding structures meaningful enough that you no longer experience them as imprisonment. Not because they remove your freedom, but because they finally give it shape.